about what is happening to wildlife in Australia, which is quite extraordinary. Australia is of course a colonial culture.
Yeah.
So that brings with it a colonial mentality. So the people who are doing the killing and the clearing of the land are all from somewhere else.
Yeah.
So we first came to Australia and started travelling the continent in 1974, and that represents 20% of the whole period of time that Europeans have been on this continent. Right. So we've been here for 1/5 of it, on and off, of course, but we know the continent intimately. If you compare that to Indigenous habitation of Australia,
yeah.
Our time here is just 1/1400. So you can see there's an immense difference. And Indigenous cultures, of course, had an impact on the landscapes. But really what's happened in the last 240 odd years in Australia is quite astounding. And that has led to vast scale extinctions of mammals and many living organisms that no one will ever know about because they would never have been documented. If we think about Australia as being unusual, the other thing we can say about it is that it is not only sort of individuals and industry that are killing wildlife. Governments of all political persuasions in the main parties are the key drivers of environmental destruction in Australia. So in Victoria, I'm in Melbourne at the moment, so in Victoria, where I am, the Victorian government will say on its websites that wildlife is protected, but they're issuing thousands of authorities to control wildlife. Victoria still has major duck hunting and waterbird hunting seasons, quail hunting seasons. And we talk about, and these are all government numbers I've given you, but in the last 10 years, something like 5 million birds have been killed in Victoria. That's the equivalent in terms of weight of about 550 Eurasian elephants. So there's been a vast loss of bird life. And in that bird life, we're talking about not only water birds, but for these authorities to control animals, to stop so-called harm. We're talking about lots of parrot species, so some of the really beautiful parrots you see, and people think of as precious, are being killed in very large numbers. We come to the very sad story of kangaroos, who are really I suppose, the leader of animal abuse on this continent. And we come across some very strange cultures in relation to the system, if you like, of killing these animals. In Victoria, where I am now, 120 odd years ago, there were 16 species in the broader family. Mm-hmm. 7 of those are now extinct, and I would put 4 more teetering on the edge of extinction. We just managed to save the red kangaroo, which exists in the western top corner of Victoria now. Its range is ever reducing from the commercial industry, because we were able to prove that the numbers were absolutely ludicrous, that the government was pushing. and trying to promote this animal as pet food, basically. If we look around the continent, we get very similar things going on in each and every state. So in South Australia now, because they're actually running out of the kangaroos they use commercially, so there's usually 3 species within a state that they're killing commercially in large numbers. Yeah. They've now added 3 more species to that list. So they've now got 6 different kinds of kangaroos and wallabies on their pet food list. And believe it or not, one of those, the Tamar wallaby, was thought to be extinct a few years ago. And until recently, the eastern grey population in South Australia, eastern grey kangaroo population in South Australia, was listed as rare, and now they're going after those too. So none of this decision making is based on science. It's a highly political, highly influenced by industry activity. And one of the things that particularly the kangaroo, killing activities do is they create all kind of social problems, because there are a lot of people in, not only in Victoria but around the country, who don't want to see shooters around their, outside of their properties, at the edge of their properties, killing kangaroos in the most brutal ways. And they're actually butchered where they're shot. And some of the things that go on in the kangaroo shooting world are pretty atrocious. So what can happen? You can imagine a very hot night. It's 35 degrees maybe out there. The kangaroos are shot so that they don't die immediately, so the heart keeps pumping. So they're laying there, often in agony on the floor until someone comes to get them to butcher them. So they shoot a few of them. Then they either finish them off or, do something horrible to them while they're still alive. The young kangaroos are killed by beating them over the head with an iron bar or hitting them against a fence post or something. So it is a terrible, and these animals are exquisitely beautiful to be with. So what goes on is a really terrible, terrible abuse of wildlife, animal life. And it's a very poor reflection on humanity. And if we think about it, when we kill a female kangaroo, we're killing 3 animals, because the shooters are supposed to make sure that the young kangaroos that are still feeding on the mother's milk are killed. They can be up to 15 months old, so they're actually quite large animals. So that joey is killed, and sometimes there's another one in the pouch. So we can kill 3 animals in one hit in the most gruesome of ways. So all that goes on, and of course that takes out the next generation. Now the very strange thing is that governments run these so-called surveys of kangaroo populations, and they exaggerate them. They exaggerate the numbers. So through various industry activities, there's a lot of kangaroo propaganda out there. So one of the big issues in Australia is that a lot of people in Australia think kangaroos are really horrible things. And this is to do with the propaganda of the industry and the endless, marketing activities that go on around all this stuff. So kangaroos appear in plagues, they descend on places, they're diseased, they're dangerous. The list of what kangaroos do, including destroying infrastructure, is completely remarkable and completely stupid. So the reality is that they do none of the things that they're supposed to do. And we had we've had 2 conservation properties in Australia, quite significant ones. And I can tell you I've lived with kangaroos when I've been lucky enough to be with them for a very long time. And they are the most beautiful animals you can ever imagine. And being with them and, you know, having visitors from all over the world coming to see them is a remarkable thrill. But none of that counts here. So, you know, this endless push and the endless propaganda to get rid of them all is quite extraordinary. So what we try and do is to say to people, look, you know your species, think about how wonderful this huge diversity of wildlife is, and, you know, try and think about it and appreciate it and see the wonder of it and the importance of it internationally, because in the end, we're actually all guardians of the planet and the places we live in. And the story is that we need to leave them in exactly the same condition as we arrived in them. And clearly that's not happening. And of course we spent, and I travel around Australia a lot, we spent 2 months around the Christmas period in these terrible fire grounds to the west of Victoria and in New South Wales. And I can tell you that was like a hell on earth. Not only was it scary and, you know, terrible to be in because of the conditions, and that's what our friends in the west coast of the United States are experiencing now. You know, it's literally hard to breathe, and you see the tragedies unfolding for the animals, the tragedies unfolding for the people who've lost their houses. All that's a very hard pill to swallow. And we brought all this on ourselves. So how we don't learn those lessons, and how we don't learn the lessons of, you know, the COVID pandemic, because that's occurred because of the way we treat animals, is quite extraordinary. So we're not only a very destructive species, we're a very self-destructive species as well. So we need to think about these things. And can you imagine living without the natural world? Because it is an intensely beautiful, remarkable, marvelous thing. And being out in, you know, whether we're in the bush in Africa or in Europe or in the Americas or here or in the Asia Pacific, being in these wild places is always, you know, one of the most beautiful experiences you can have. And being in the remote parts of Australia, that's also very beautiful. And if we think about, you know, the Australian continent is incredibly diverse. I mean, there are, you know, mountain ranges here with snow on them. You know, there are vast deserts. There are tropical rainforests. You know, any kind of habitat biome you can imagine, it exists here. What we need to understand is that in these sort of colonial cultures, the predominant economic activity is primary industry. And if they're kind of unsophisticated, then they're very damaging to the environment. And that's what we've got on this continent. So if we look at the sort of farming activity goes on, there's heavy land clearing. In Queensland, that was accounting for, you know, at the turn of this century in 2000, something like 100 million mammals, birds and reptiles a year. Big chunk of those were reptiles, just being squashed by bulldozers and things. So you've got all these mechanisms working towards the destruction of animal life. And one of the things we notice when we travel across the Australian continent in the old days when we were driving, you know, through the bush, the windscreens of the cars would be so full of insects, nothing you can do to avoid them being squashed on the windscreen, I'm afraid. We used to have to get out and clean them off, you know, otherwise you couldn't see out of the windows. Nowadays, there are almost no insects at all. So that shift is alarming and I think very scary. So one of the things we worry about as we get older is what happens to young people. And that's really at the forefront of our minds. And, you know, one of our jobs around the world with our filmmaking and all the other knowledge-based stuff that we do is not only education, but it's about connecting cultures all over the world. So we know lots of families in lots of places, from Masai land to Ainu land in northern Japan, Hokkaido, and on it goes. And we worry about all those children and what it's going to be like for you. What kind of world have we left for you? And in saying that, it's incumbent on all of us to try and change things so that your world in the future is a much better one than it looks to be now. And you too, of course, have a role in trying to change things. You're not silent because it's your future, it's your world. So it would be great if you could all get together and help us, you know, save some of these animals. Think about the animals, learn about them, try and work with them, try and go and see them somewhere, you know, and just try and understand what a life for a wild animal is like in today's world. In Australia, for example, we call the landscapes of fear, because those animals are endlessly wary about being shot or killed in some other gruesome way. And we've got lots of stories about these things, which I won't talk to you about now. But the things that really bother me now are the scale of the cruelty and the lack of empathy and the lack of kindness. So let's try and be kind to animals. Let's try and empathize with them. Let's try and imagine that we are animals ourselves, that we are in these circumstances, and try and think about that so we empathize with what are often very beautiful creatures just trying to lead a life. And we have no right to destroy that for them or to destroy their home. So let's care about planet Earth. Let's care about future generations of all living things. And in that way, you and your future families will have a much happier life and a much more enjoyable life, and a life you can share with the natural world.
Thank you so much.